Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Muse Writers Center's live stream. We're here to celebrate Luisa A. Igloria as the Commonwealth of Virginia's newest Poet Laureate. We have a wonderful evening scheduled for tonight. We're going to start in a few minutes with a brief reading by three of the students from the ODU MFA program. And the ODU MFA program is the co-host of this special event. If you're watching this and are interested in starting an MFA, Luisa and now John McManus have made the ODU program one of the best in the nation, for real. It's fantastic, and they have amazing teachers there. So after the three students read, Luisa will read from her work, and then we'll have ample time for questions and discussion. And if you want to ask a question, go to the Facebook live stream and type the question in the comments section, and it would be helpful if you write the word question first, so that we know it's a question and not a compliment. And then our program director, Sean Gervin, will see it easily and pass it our way. And we want to thank Sean for setting all this up and being our fine producer. And before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit more about the Muse Writers Center in Norfolk, Virginia. We have become one of the largest literary centers in the country. And since we are still dealing with the coronavirus crisis, all of our classes and events are online. And we still have a few classes yet to come this summer, but our fall class schedule will be out on Monday. And it features a lot of classes with amazing teachers, including Luisa A. Igloria. Also, we offer tuition help to anyone who needs it, and we never turn anyone away due to their finances. We don't want anything getting in the way of someone who wants to enjoy the literary arts and deepen their craft. We also offer hundreds of free literary events every year, which are all now online. And just so you know, coming up tomorrow, we are hosting a reading and discussion in celebration of the launch of Seneca Lofton and Donnell McGee's new book, American Reverie, from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And then next week, we are hosting a reading and discussion called A Celebration of Women Writers in Translation. And that will be on Sunday, August 30th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, featuring many great readers and panelists, including our Poet Laureate, Luisa A. Igloria, and former Poet Laureate of Virginia, Sophia Starnes. I'm sorry? Oh. Well, apparently my video wasn't on. I'm not sure why not. Hi, everybody. I assume you heard everything, but I'm going to just keep on going. I appreciate Sean letting me know my video is not on, but now it is. Anyway, that was kind of silly, and I apologize. But anyway, you can learn more about the Muse, our classes, and our events on our website, the-muse.org. And all of our events are live streamed here on our Facebook page and also on their event page on the website. And just one last announcement before we get started. It goes without saying that all the work read from the readers is their original work, and they retain all rights to it. Some of what will be read today is published in print or online, and some may be unpublished work. The live stream is in no way a publication of any unpublished works. And now let's welcome our guest readers from the ODU MFA program, who will now kick things off with their wonderful words. We're going to hear from Courtney Tala, Matthew Olive, and first from Tracy Rice Weber. Tracy, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. It is my pleasure to be here to honor our Poet Laureate of Virginia, Dr. Luisa Igloria, mentor, advisor, and friend. Luisa's work has influenced my own writing journey immeasurably, as I'm certain it has for so many of us who have read her work or who have had the privilege to study under her benevolent guidance. In an article on Audience, Luisa wrote that among the themes in her work is the, quote, complicated dynamics of family, the tangled relationships between history, time, and memory, end quote. I've been invited to share a poem of my own, and I think you may find the influence apparent. Downsize begins with a single chest of drawers. Swollen now, summer makes each casket stick, a grave chore, this robbing of souvenirs, this season for excavating artifacts from our living. The weight of sorting, throw away, give away, keep. why I can't let go of 3 umbilical cords wrapped in cotton handkerchiefs or notebook paper envelopes that failed to preserve the baby teeth we exchanged for nickels and dimes. Construction paper, birthday cards eventually break down in the heart of a chest of drawers pulled loose from its tongue and groove, in a frame gone wobbly from what was once a flurry of use. Years later, a stone, a valentine, a cut of lavender vine still holds the scent of meaning. I mean, I must have kept it all for something. Thank you, Luisa.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Matthew Olive, and I don't have as beautifully prepared words as that, but I'll just say that I think the first semester of the MFA program is so important. It's very make or break. You don't know if like you're gonna have a lot of hope or like lose all your hope. So thankfully, Luisa just really instilled a great amount of hope in through her generosity, and it's only gotten better. And thank you. So I'm going to be reading The Naval Remains. The Naval Remains. A Hindu goddess taught me that when people die, their bodies must be burnt to allow their souls space to detach from the physical plane. Today, they burn first in open air, then in electrical ovens, till, according to stories, all that's left is their belly buttons. Their navels stay their sacred center after all else has lost its gaze. In other traditions, the navel, the axis mundi, is the column to which all layers attach themselves to create an image related to the center of the earth, or, like the umbilical cord, an image of nourishment. All my life, I have related sustainment to this permanent scar, related it to a cold column rather than my mother, her mother, or all the mothers who couldn't have me without separation or difference. The point of the vertical axis is that it stays the same all the way up. I've tried for so long to understand what isn't familiar over what is. After the bodies have burned, the navels have remained. Relatives chuck them into rivers where fish eat them and swim away to plates. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Courtney. And so I'm going to try and keep this quick. But like Matt said, when I came into the program that very first semester, I, was what I would call like a very new writer. So I was very hesitant. I was nervous and I had no idea what I was doing. But as soon as I walked into that first workshop with Luisa, I immediately just felt her warmth. And I knew that while at the moment I wasn't really sure what I was doing, I was in very capable hands. And so I feel so honored and lucky to have been able to work so closely with Luisa for the past almost 3 years now, and I'm not ready for it to end. But so the poem that I'm going to read tonight kind of came about through some of the talks that we've had together about the thesis project. And the question that Luisa asked me was, well, I guess what I'll say first is that I'm dealing with inheritance and what is passed down through families and what is also lost. And so Luisa's question to me was, how will I make it possible for my children to know where they came from and to trace their bloodline, which is where this poem came from. And it starts with an epigraph. Which is, in ancient Philippine mythology, Tala is known as the goddess of the stars, creator of the constellations. And the poem is called Bedtime Story for My Possible Future Child. If I should have a child, I imagine they'll want some light to soften the darkness of their room. Like my parents did for me, I'll build the universe into their ceiling, pressing each adhesive star into place one by one until their whole room glows. Many say the stars we see are already dead, but that's not quite right. Like us, they are born, they live. In the end, the light will go out. But darkness is not the opposite of light, just the absence of it. I don't know if this brings solace or unease. If they're afraid of the dark, I'll tell them their mother is a descendant of the stars, sent to Earth from Tala herself. The story goes like this. Each shimmering orb light years away is a cousin, a sibling, each fractured constellation a limb branching from the same family tree. I'll tell them one day when I'm gone, if they miss me, just look up. Light is the fastest thing in the universe. The stars burn far longer than our eyes will live to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Courtney and Matthew and Tracy. That was wonderful, and it's great to hear. Louisa's students read, because she's part of your poetic life, and I love that we're here to celebrate Louisa, because I can't think of anyone who deserves to be poet laureate more than she deserves it. And I also feel like it's such a great choice, because she's going to do so much, not only for the poetry community in Virginia, but for the literary community in Virginia. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Luisa A. Igloria, the 20th Poet Laureate of the Commonwealth of Virginia. She is one of 2 co-winners of the 2019 Crab Orchard Poetry Open Competition for her manuscript, Maps for Migrants and Ghosts, which is forthcoming this year. In 2015, she was the inaugural winner of the Resurgence Prize, the world's first major award for echo poetry, selected by former UK Poet Laureate Sir Andrew Motion, Alice Oswald, and Joe Shapcott. Former US Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey selected her chapbook, What is Left of Wings, I Ask, as the 2018 recipient of the Center for the Book Arts Letterpress Poetry Chapbook Prize. Other works include The Buddha Wonders If She Is Having a Midlife Crisis. Read that book, by the way. Everyone who's hearing this, read that book. Ode to the Heart Smaller Than a Pencil Eraser, and 12 other books. She is a Luis I. Jaffe Endowed Professor and University Professor of English and Creative Writing, and teaches on the faculty of the MFA Creative Writing program at Old Dominion University, which she directed from 2009 to 2015. And she is also a teacher and member of the board of directors here at the Muse Writers Center. Let's all welcome and enjoy Luisa A. Igloria.
Thank you, Michael. Am I on? All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I know that friends are watching from different parts of the world, and I really appreciate your taking time out. Thank you, first of all, to Michael Candlewall, who is the Executive Director of the Muse, to Program Manager Sean Gervan, and the Program Associate Anna Fitzgerald for organizing this event in collaboration with the MFA Creative Writing Program at Old Dominion University. I also want to thank my colleagues, friends, and students, and you've heard 3 of our amazing poets in the program, and I know that they will go on to they are already starting to do great things in poetry, so I can't thank you all enough. And finally, friends of the Muse board and all the wonderful Muse students who make up this vital community of writers in Hampton Roads, thank you for your support. So by way of another sort of addition to the introductions, most of my family and I have lived in Norfolk since 1998. And when I first got here as a new faculty member, to be honest, I wasn't sure how long we would stay. For the first 2 years, though I'd been hired as part of Old Dominion's commitment to develop Filipino-American studies, I was only on a visiting appointment. And it wasn't until a few years later that my appointment was converted to that of a full-time position, and this time in the MFA program. So, but now though, for a while, it felt like I was even afraid to take out all our books out of moving boxes and put them on the shelves. It's like a big commitment, right? And we moved from one apartment to another, only fairly recently becoming first-time homeowners. And we blinked, and now 22 years has passed. In so many ways, then, this place, ODU and the Muse included, has grown to be my academic home and my writing community, my community. So as I mentioned when I took my oath as Virginia Poet Laureate, this is such a big honor. And as an immigrant and as the fourth Poet Laureate of color and the first Filipina-American Virginia Poet Laureate, I also have the hope that through the arts, we can continue to do the work of eradicating social, educational, and other inequities. But let me read some poems for you, all right? So I've decided tonight to read poems that are all new and that I don't believe any of them are published in any journal or book yet. I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to share them. So I will begin with a poem called Being in the World. My college philosophy professor just returned from years of study at a famous university in Belgium, was heady with concepts on being and time. He'd say, does a donkey concern itself with being a donkey, or a bird concern itself with being a bird? No, but humans must by nature perennially concern themselves with being certain types of persons. I suppose some part of this is true. Some days I believe I can do things. There are infinite possibilities. And other days when all I want to do is eat carbs and cry. According to Heidegger, who I learned was banned from teaching for a number of years because he was sympathetic with the Nazis, humans are the only ones who ponder and define for themselves what it means to be a being in the world for others. The world should be like a house where we can live and make for ourselves a place of comfort and familiarity, or a snail shell into which a small, sinuous body can be left undisturbed to coil into the library of its own solitude. But the horse is out there, trampling the field or dragging a man other men have strung to the reins like a plow. And the boy who whistled like a bird in front of a country store has his eye gouged out and his head and face beaten until it is almost the same liquid blue as the river. Every night now, in streets thick with smoke and tear gas, some beings swing clubs and fire bullets, while other beings fall or stand their ground. Segue into a sort of similarly themed poem, which is titled On Suffering. In a city filled with spires, in a cathedral left of the square, is a smaller chapel with a statue of a wild boar and a painting of the Virgin with 7 lances stuck in her heart. This must be extremely painful. And yet she looks up toward the ceiling or the sky or heaven as though her sorrows have lifted her to a weirdly tranquil space beyond everyday understanding. And somewhere in another city is a very old street which bears the name of suffering, because a bishop was decapitated there on the way to becoming a saint. A famous writer used it as the setting for a story about a lost necklace. His 2 characters coming home from a ball scour every inch of the street in the cold pall of morning, then surrender to a life of penury. And they must bear it, for is there any other recourse? Which only goes to show how the saintly are not so different after all from the rest of us, merely trying to make it from day to day. They love their children so much, though they know their hearts will be irremediably broken. They go into the streets speaking of what they believe. They give in to a bit of desire, wanting to feel, even for a few hours, the gleam of something extraordinary around their necks. that story. You know, almost every other semester, it's the story, The Necklace. Some of you probably know it and have taught it or have it in class. So we are still in the global period of pandemic, and I know that we, I think, feel like we're going crazy sometimes, or we have strange dreams. And so I'm going to read a few poems that are kind of tapping into that. My dream life has changed in this season of pandemic. The verbs most active in each scene include escalate and isolate. In each dream, we love our bodies more fiercely than we acknowledge in real life. And there are bodies to spring from cages encircled with wires, bodies on which we must pour basins of cool water to prevent them from going up in flames. We lose our bodies over and over or watch from the sidelines as they take on one impossible form after another. A man with blue fingers, a fish with accordion lungs, a tree in whose nets of complicated leaves pale lanterns float, each with a face of children or dead lovers. Do you remember the sound we should make to exit the dream? If we walked without needing to stop and account for our whereabouts, we'd make a pilgrimage. We'd look for a hut in the hills or a town by the sea, where saints clap their hands and cry out with pleasure when someone finally brings them what they were always waiting for. So here's a poem that is titled with a question. Is it still permitted to talk about the heart? To say at least how some days it feels covered with moss, at other times with a thin husk like paper, the one that can't seem to hold any more ink. Long ago, women slept with the words they wrote all day in secret by the window or under a tree while they waited for lovers or the lady they served. Then a mere gesture overflowed, honey on the spoon and on the tongue. Children still children until they no longer were. Clouds formed only on the bottom of teacups. These days I write but don't necessarily feel unburdened. Too many dead, too many dying, and this heart of moss wanting to be a sail filling up with wind, not a scroll with all the names of everyone it has lost. I've been writing some poems that are addressed to America these days. I've seen a number of poets come out with similar poems, and I also wanted to write my own letter to America poems. So they're sort of epistolary. And here's one that's called You Can't Talk to Us Like That. America, I've got a touch of cabin fever too, and wish I could go to a favorite restaurant again. Walk down a short flight of steps into the cool brick-lined interior of what used to be a speakeasy. Wouldn't it be great to order a dozen each of the local oyster varieties, some bread and butter, a nice pull of something bubbly? Would sing happy birthday or happy anniversary while clinking glasses and taking group pictures. But what if there's a man at a nearby table whose hatred boils over at the sight of anyone, but especially brown people like us, having the gumption to reach for a little joy during this time of sickness and despair, which sometimes feels worse than death? America, he thinks we cannot be in the same room with him. So we get video rolling We ask him to repeat the hateful obscenities he's hurled our way so he can be held accountable and shown out of the building. We hold our ground, America. After all the years our kind broke their backs and your hard soil to bring fruit and grain to your table, just so you can put a clean white cloth and a crystal service on it. After graveyard shifts during which our kind daily tend to your sick and dying, we have the right to be here, and the wages are overdue. So one more America poem. This is fairly recent. We had a bit of bad weather a few weeks ago. So this is simply called America. America, it's the day after another hurricane hurtles through towns, a fringe of tornadoes leading the way. The Baptist church on the corner of 38th and Bluestone has its face sheared off completely by blades of wind. Oak trees lie on their sides, unpinned from lawns. Pine branches intersect with power lines. America, I used to believe in your storied generosity, how firefighters and volunteers alike paddled through high water to pluck shivering families off their roofs, how police tapped on the window to ask if everything was all right, instead of ordering an entire family, down to the youngest child, lie on the asphalt, arms crossed behind their backs. My only crime, said Carlos Bulosan, is to be a Filipino in America. The nurse who checks your vitals in the crowded ICU first studied to be a teacher, and her husband who drives a truck has a degree in physics. All night, the warning signals blare on and off. One of the neighbors worries about the man who sat bundled in a blanket on the corner across the drugstore. The rain was still falling, but there was no more room in the shelters. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit, but it's sort of still thinking about, what do you do if you want to escape this bad movie and you're trying to find the exit? So as a reminder, go vote, people, right? November is just around the corner. Go and vote. So this is a poem called Self-Portrait with Soft Ropes and Escape. I'm a poor imitation of a parrot as boss or calendar planner. I do better as a minor Houdini, untangling a bowl of pasta ropes with my tongue. Even better as a lint roller who insists there can be a little more life after one square. At meetings, I've learned to copy the language of band synthetics. Transparency, opacity, longevity. Does knowing a thing can never be destroyed make it happy? Growing up in a family of breakfast table knife throwers, I'm still trying to learn the pose serene Buddha of glacial composure. Several times a day, I am torn between misery and elation, disappointment and hope. Just pick one, anyone, they say with impatience. But when I finally make my candy selection, I wind up with the one with a goopy center that tastes like cough medicine. Those who don't really know me say, you have such a charmed life. When I close my eyes, I see a line of water buffaloes in tutus kicking up their heels. The ensemble has yet to stage Carmen, but when they do, I want it to be only that part where she sings her beguiling seguidilla and convinces the officer of the guard to untie her bonds. Her laughter is the sound made by clear glass marbles rolling away, little wicks of trapped color pulsing like flames. So there's just a few more poems that I'd like to read. And okay, I grew up in a household where people were always cooking, trying to see what was available to turn into a meal. And it was a household in which we were told not to waste anything, or there would be dire consequences. So this is a poem called Home Economics. Where I grew up, I was taught to save everything for soup or sauce. Fins, bones, the heads of shrimp for their orange fat, dripping sweetbreads of the slaughtered animal to bulk up a meal, spread like a blanket over many days with sizzling onions and wild lime juice. There are whole towns who perfected the art of chiseling lace out of watermelon rinds, roasting rice wafers to string with thread and float from windows on feast days. Feast being less about tables groaning with the weight of food and more about yoking hunger to the ceremonies of using every part, every inch of skin, every sinew, each chalky eyeball swimming in its papery bowl, as sweet as everything else milked from another body in the world for you. So here's a sort of also food related poem, but I'm going to slip into a little bit of a lighter vein. There are all kinds of recordings you can find on SoundCloud and all of these other sites where you can hear amazing things. So this one is called Listen to the Recordings on SoundCloud of Gorillas Singing Little Food Songs to Themselves. A scientist describes one of these as the equivalent of a sigh of contentment, and the other a low frequency hum. Also, how adorable is it that they make up different songs for different foods? Perhaps not so adorable how it's mainly alpha male silverbacks that sing to express enjoyment while they eat. What about the females? Do they hum songs they compose under their breath? Do they sing with other females together in a bower of green stalks or by the water as they groom each other's hair? What they do is supposed to show how their bodies instinctively make sounds for life's varied textures and flavors. Moans or yelps, prolonged groans informing anyone within earshot that here in the mouth is a moment of such particular relish, or in the toenail a splinter of unbearable agony. Who knows if they call each other names like sweet pea or cupcake, sugar pie or honey bun, if it's the ripe calabash or the pulpy soursop that elicits the most ecstatic songs, second only to the gurgling that infants make as they drink the milk before their eyes glaze and their heads loll back in pleasure. So that is a little fun poem to write. Well, actually, I will read something from a book before my closing poem. And this is from my book of prose poems, Night Willow, from Phoenicia Publishing. And it's a poem called Liminal. Liminal, or an inlet. An inlet might be good, might be a little enclosure, a leading into or away. Marsh, lagoon, bay, sound, estuary, tide pool, terrace, shelf, strand. As in to be stranded for a little while with me, myself, and I might learn to work free of pretense, defense. Tonight, if we're going out for dinner, can it be someplace where there isn't a lot of noise. Guinness World Records list the anechoic test chamber of a lab in Minneapolis as the quietest place in the world. Sitting in the dark in its double walls of insulated steel, concrete, and fiberglass acoustic wedges, you'd hear your heartbeats echoing, your organs paddling in their shallow pools. You become the sound. The longest anyone sat there is 3/4 of an hour before he begged to be released and became disoriented. I believe it. How many times have I woken at dawn from dread spreading through my chest, loud pounding in my ears, the telephone's insistent chime? Scholars, facile with their shiny hoard of new discursive phrases, write off the liminal. I lodge there often, where possibility is its most ambiguous flower. And for my final poem, and thank you again for spending this program with us, with me, it's also a new poem. It's called Dream Making. So you know how they say that it's very important for artists and writers and musicians. All of us, actually, we all need this to cultivate that space in the imagination where we can go and spend some dreaming time with ourselves. So that is the condition for anything to be made out of art, out of music, out of words. So this poem is called Dream Making. I want to wear the round beaded earrings with fringed golden tassels my eldest daughter got for me, made by women who live in Lake Cebu, famous for the Tiboli weave they make called tinalak, stripped abaca bark, organically dyed of bark and leaves, each ripply panel the equivalent of a chapter from a dream. I wonder what pattern I could pull from my own dreams, especially if I've forgotten about them as soon as I open my eyes. I think everyone should be given a chance to make something tangible from a dream at least once. A recipe dictated in a dream, a dress with glorious detail they've only ever seen in a dream, a mural or collage in which wildflowers open their mouths like a choir to sing the most unforgettable songs never heard by the human ear. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Louisa. That was wonderful.
Hey,
So what we're going to do now is I have a few questions I've prepared for you to start a discussion, and I have a couple also for your students. But I just want to remind that if you are watching on Facebook, or if you're watching anywhere, go to Facebook and you can ask a question in the comments, and Sean will relay it to us here in the event. So my first question for you, Louisa, is in your public statements since being named Poet Laureate, occasionally you've said that being Poet Laureate is a responsibility that one person alone cannot and should not fulfill, that the good things we want to do through poetry can be better accomplished through a shared effort. So what can we do to get involved? What can we do to get on board with your Poet Laureate
hi.
program?
I'm so glad you asked that question because now I can make, requests for
That's
help.
great.
Yeah, and along with the Poetry Society of Virginia, who, of course, as we all know, is responsible for the process of nominating candidates for the Poet Laureateship and moving these materials forward to the office of the governor in Richmond. So I know that that is an organization which is dedicated to poetry in the state. And so I have sent out an email in the last 2 weeks to the the regional vice presidents of the Poetry Society of Virginia, um, letting them know that if there's anything I can do in my capacity as Poet Laureate in the next 2 years, I would definitely love to work with everybody. So some of the things I've been thinking of in terms of, this group effort, and I think I may have mentioned it in another interview, for instance, just knowing who the Virginia poets are. is there a place, is there a resource where we can go to find that information? So one of the first things I did was to look at the Wikipedia page listing Virginia poets, not just the poet laureates, because that's fairly complete, but Virginia poets in general. And it's not been updated. So I really want your help in identifying who. I know this is a large state. There are many wonderful poets. There are younger poets, there are more contemporary poets, there are poets of every, walk of life, every, they're not just poets, but they may be working in other capacities besides in the schools or in the arts. There may be poets who are nurses, who are doctors, who are firefighters, who are undertakers. I would like people's help in identifying where these resources are. So that's one thing. And hopefully also be able to create conversations. I would like to try and see how I can start maybe curate a series of like readings or panels such as this one, Michael, that you're also good at staging for the Muse, and also feature Virginia poets in these. So lots of different things. About a week ago, I think I woke up with another idea in my head, and I haven't had a chance to flesh that out yet, but I was thinking maybe I could do some like poetry prompts that could be used statewide in, all different stages of writers can share in that, not just a labor, but I think people who love poetry are always looking for something to spark their excitement, their imagination. So
That's a wonderful idea. I mean,
yeah.
you could always have the governor send them out, or you could mention to the various newspapers in the state. That would be
Sure,
wonderful.
sure.
Get the
Yeah,
entire state to be writing poetry.
right. And if anybody has great ideas, please send them my way.
So we have our first question from Facebook.
Yeah.
It's from Rodrigo de la Pena Jr. And he says, first of all, congratulations, Luisa. I see the lizards in your background. Can you say something about your affinity with lizards?
Okay. Yeah. And also my Instagram handle is the Poets Lizard. No, Poets Lizard. My Twitter handle is the Poets Lizard. So I think it comes from being someone who comes from Baguio City in the Philippines, in the Northern Cordillera. And in the folklore, there's a lot of stories about the lizard being a sort of fabled creature. And I like the idea of how it is so metaphorical in its ability to regenerate parts of itself that have been lopped off. So I like that very much. That appeals to me very much. And also when I was a graduate student in Chicago doing my PhD program, I think I had something like a waking dream where I saw a creature in front of me, and I think it was a lizard, and it brushed against my forearm, and it felt like some kind of spirit animal. So since then, when I told people, I told friends about that story, they started gifting me with all sorts of lizard paraphernalia, mostly, for home decor or wearables. So that's where that comes from. But yeah, so I like that idea primarily of the lizard being able to regenerate and, survive because of this quality.
That's wonderful. Before we get to some other questions, I wanted to give your students an opportunity to ask you a question.
Sure.
If any of them would like, if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, unmute yourself and speak up. Or maybe they just want to listen. I'm not sure. Tracy, did you have a question? You have to unmute yourself. Oh, okay. No, not yet. So you guys think of some questions if you want. I just wanted to offer the space for you to ask. This is your opportunity to grill your teacher and ask her whatever you'd like. So I have another question that I wanted to see what your thoughts were on. One of the themes you have mentioned as a focus for your tenure as Poet Laureate, as our 20th Poet Laureate in the Commonwealth of Virginia, is poetry as witness. So tell me a little bit about how poetry and poets can be a witness to what's happening in the world and in our hearts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think I spoke about that too a little bit at my swearing in ceremony.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked about how other poets have actually spoken much more eloquently about the idea of poetry as witness. But the whole idea is that we are in the world and we need to give witness to our living in it. And this means that language can be used not just to make up things, but to do other kinds of different things, like testify to the truth, testify to realities that we see around us, injustice that we see, injustices, or ways in which we might give voice to things that are difficult to express because we live under either conditions of duress or terror or any of that sort of thing. So I think poets have always played a role in the different societies and culture in which they're from, to lend their language, to give their effort towards these kinds of things. And the whole idea is that poetry is not just some kind of pretty pastime. It's not a hobby. It's not, I mean, it's real engagement with the world, because to be a poet, one must recognize that it's a different kind of attention that you need to pay to the world around you. And it requires being able to imagine what it's like to be in another's shoes. So that sets the condition of empathy, which is a cornerstone not only of imagination or literature, but also of community. So how can we not be involved in that? So that's, I guess, it may not be the most accurate way to talk about it. The idea of witnessing comes in different forms. You know, you can witness by writing journalism. You can witness by working on the front lines. You can witness by teaching others, you know, educating others about the realities that we are witnessing. And there's not just one form of witness. So I'm not trying to sort of inflate the idea of poetry as being this special place of effort. I think we all have a role to play in making sure that we are able to talk about the world that we see and talk about the world we'd like to build.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I want to just remind people that if you have a question on Facebook, just type it in the comments. Maybe write the word question first. We have another one here from Natasha Robinson, and she asks, during this pandemic and time of turmoil, is it easier for you to write in the middle of emotion, or to wait until some of the emotion is past and then collect your thoughts?
Hmm. It depends. Sometimes something will nudge very insistently at some corner of my brain or some corner of my heart, and I'll want to immediately work it out, whatever that is. I think I've said elsewhere too that what I do in poetry, I realize that it's my preferred place for going to poems is my preferred place for processing what I'm trying to understand about the world. So it's like, you know, in my head, it's like a constant first draft. Or so that is probably different from day to day. Some days it might feel more insistent. Some days it might feel like, okay, you have a little bit more luxury to kind of look back on what you might have thought or felt at an earlier time before you sat down to write. But for me, it's all just part of the way I process information, process experience. I prefer to process them through poems, because there I can think about things in terms of images and concrete things and not just abstractions, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah.
Um,
But thank you for that question, Natasha.
yeah. So we have not a question, but more of a comment from Ina Carino. Wildflowers open their mouths like a choir. Uh, Wildflower open their mouths like a choir. Sounds never heard by a human ear. She loves that.
Okay.
Um, and then we have a question
Modern.
from from Sharon Polk. Louisa, which poets have had the greatest influence on you?
Hmm. Oh, so many. It's very hard to pinpoint just one or two. But I know my students will testify to the fact that I always try to bring in Lorca, Federico Garcia Lorca, in any craft or poetry conversation. That's like one of my touchstones. This is unfair. So he's very influential, but I resonate mostly with poets of color also, because I find that what they write about in their poems resonates most closely to my own experience as an immigrant, as a woman of color, as a poet of color. So yeah,
So that brings me to a question I was thinking about, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you've made it a passion to identify and amplify the voices of underrepresented poets in Virginia. So you talk a little bit more about what you'd like to do there. I think it's so important, Louisa, and I
Yeah.
think that people need to really understand how important that is.
Yes. So, like I said, I would like to curate some kind of series where I can reach out and be in touch with all different kinds of poets, and especially underrepresented poets, poets from groups that have not really had that much of a presence in, settings like these where they can read their work or let others know where their work might be found. So it'll take a little bit of planning, and it is also this very busy part, which is right at the beginning of our return to the school semester. So I'm thinking that maybe I was a little bit ambitious when I thought I could do it like by the middle of September, but I'm thinking more like probably October. And again, this is where I'll need everyone's help. So I'd like to curate these like readings or conversations around some of the themes that attach to the things we were talking about. How can you witness through poems? Um, what can poets contribute to the conversation of community building and healing?
And we would certainly love to be involved with that as
Yes,
well here at the Muse Writers Center. And I can no longer speak for the Poetry Society because I'm not on their board anymore, but I
oh,
know that our Eastern Regional Vice President Kendra
right,
McDonald,
right.
I'm sure would be
Yes,
very
she's already
interested.
reached out to me, so I'm very excited.
That's wonderful. We do have some more questions from Facebook,
Yeah.
and I wanted to just mention, if you're watching on Facebook, just write the question in the comments and they'll be relayed to us. Here's one from Jonathan Rivera. How does your poetry inform your teaching and vice versa?
Well, sometimes I laugh and joke with my students. I have to do this. I sometimes do the prompts or exercises around the workshop table along with them. I craft prompts or assignments, and I feel like, I need street cred and I need to do this with them. So it's an active process of learning. I don't feel like I am the fount of poetic wisdom or anything. I think that I'm simply there to facilitate the energies of discussion or exchange, and to show them what I've been excited about in terms of poets and poetry that I've read. And in turn, I learn very much from my students also. So it's a two-way thing. It's not, from the top down. I think in the most ideal setting, it's we have a really exciting conversation around the table, and we don't want to leave. And we're like, when we leave the classroom, we're all fired up. We want to go to our writing space right away and work on these ideas that are just brimming over. That's the most exciting thing. And I think, the spirit of exchange is so important in a teaching setting. It's not just theory. So it's theory and practice, right? You can't write unless you write. You can't do that unless you read. And you can't, do all those things unless you have this like ongoing conversation about what it is and why it's so important that you're doing this.
Absolutely. I think it's a good segue into me asking your students a question. And perhaps it's a little, uh, it's about a question about you, but so to your students who are here with us today, if you could just tell me the best piece of advice or feedback or teaching you received from Louisa and how it's informed your work. We can, anyone may jump in. I mean, maybe you have hundreds of them you could mention, but I just sort of wanted to get a sense from your students about their relationship with you and craft. Well, we can start with Tracy. Tracy's wide-eyed. Go ahead, Tracy.
Recently, I think more than a couple of times, Louisa has said to me when I've presented a rough draft, and then she'll ask me questions about what perhaps I'd intended to write, and after we talk, she says, "You're holding out on me. Why didn't you tell me all those things? You've got to write it all." And so I think, and then, as she said, as soon as she speaks that to me, I want to go and write it all, but then she has to remind me that over and over again, that because I have a tendency to kind of hold on to information, and I'm stingy with it, and sometimes it's hard to cut loose. So I think cutting loose is probably, don't hold out.
Awesome. How about Matthew?
It's kind of similar. There's like so much I don't even know. Like she completely changed my idea of poetry. So I would say I can get pretty weird, and she's never dissuaded me from it. She actually pushes me to be even more weird, which I appreciate because that's usually not the case with most poetry professors. But she's so skilled that she can like tangle my weirdness. I think it's good out of hand.
That's a wonderful thing, actually. We have a class coming up in the fall called Writing the Weird, and it's important to embrace that's not the same as everything else. I think that's wonderful. Courtney, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so it's like Matt said, it's really hard to even just narrow it down to one thing. But I think one of the more recent things that we've talked about, like during our thesis meetings and things like that, is about writing from a place of joy. And especially now when, the world doesn't feel very joyous, or, like it's hard to write about happy things, but still trying to find a way to incorporate like that sense of joy or that sense of wonder into a poem, even if it might be talking about a darker subject or something that's a little bit more like mellow. And so I think that has helped to just balance the tones out, just so that everything's not on that one note. So I just think that that's been really helpful for me recently, especially.
That's wonderful. Let me get my glasses on and go to our next question from our audience. Let's see here. Here we go. This is from Gail Kent. Did you ever write poetry in Tagalog? And how has being an immigrant affected your relationship with language?
Well, I come from the north, so my tongue is much more attuned to the grooves of Ilocano, which is another of the languages in the Philippines. It's what's spoken up in the Ilocos region. My parents are both Ilocano. So I've written a little bit in Ilocano. I think there's one in an anthology that was published here, edited by Nick Carbo a while ago. And while I can read Tagalog or Filipino, I don't feel like I'm as well versed in that language. I can speak it and read it, but I have done a few translations, which are close collaborations rather, with the poets that have written these poems. And so that has been fruitful for me. And I know this is kind of like a different way to answer your question, Gail, but when I was growing up in our household, there were 3 languages spoken at the same time. I came to awareness of 3 languages at the same time. So Tagalog or Filipino, Ilocano, and English. And I went to a school where we were fined 5 centavos for every word in the vernacular that we spoke during school hours. So of course, I learned my English very well, right? So I feel like part of me sometimes wonders if, therefore, with that kind of simultaneous exposure to these 3 languages, why could I not consider English as a kind of first language too? So sort of hierarchy in the idea of certain languages being more superior than other languages is also sort of being put under question. I think I just saw an article headline today about how the Oxford English Dictionary or something considers Philippine English, like acceptable. And I'm like, of course, duh. So there's that.
I think I saw that article.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet. I just saw the title, the headline floating around today. Yeah.
I haven't read it either, but I definitely saw the headline.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question. Again, if you're on Facebook or on watching this live, you can ask questions in the comment section and write the word question first so we easily see it. Here's one from Drew Lopenzina. My wife Barb wants to know how we can engage children in the public schools in poetry and keep it into an active process.
And keep it what?
Keep it an active process. Keep on engaging children in the schools.
Yeah, I think just the whole idea of presenting language as a place to play, because language has shapes, has sounds. If we don't teach it as if it were a thing that can be used to torture students, then I think we would get much different results. And I think also from having in the maybe 10 years ago, I participated in these processes of judging in the different public schools and the elementary school level. Children would memorize poems and recite them. I forget what it's called. It's like not.
I think it's called Poetry Out Loud.
No, for poetry recitations, I think is more what it is. But
Okay.
I was kind of surprised that they were uniformly reading only a certain type of poem. And I thought there's such a wealth of poetry out there. You can give them Neruda, you can give them Robert Frost, you can give them Emily Dickinson, you know, even as young as kindergarten or preschool, they appreciate words. And just to make it a habit to journal, to develop this whole idea of a writing practice as a place where you can go to make pictures with words and hear the sounds that they make, and where nothing is necessarily wrong, but it's, you know, part of the way you express your individual like self and your imagination. So I think that would be much more productive than like all of these things that you kind of din into students and demand some kind of regurgitated version of.
Or writing an essay about it.
Right, right.
I mean, your idea of poetry as play,
Yeah.
that's a wonderful thing. We should all remember that creation of art is fun.
Right, right. And I think children are so natural at thinking in images.
Mm-hmm.
They metaphors like pour out of their mouths without them even thinking about it.
Right, and stories and characters and
Stories, yes.
and mixing things up. You know, I love reading, you know, different. I've judged some kids' writing contests too, and some of the things they think of, it's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have we have our first grandchild, Oliver. You know, they live in Charlottesville, and his mother reported that one day he woke up one morning and said, "Good morning, Basil. What did you dream of?" And that sort of natural conversation with the world is just so amazing, and we kind of lose that as we grow older. And I think it's the idea of vulnerability, willing ourselves to open up to things and not be ashamed or not
Right.
think about what people will think.
Well, I think some people are afraid to write sometimes because they're afraid of doing it wrong, and I think what you're saying is there's no wrong, especially in the early drafts, as we call it, and as the poets, you know, we have early drafts. But you know, I always tell my students that I never learned anything from doing it right the first time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, you don't learn if
Mm-hmm.
no one tells you
Mm-hmm.
anything different, then you just don't learn. And it's wonderful to be open to learning and making
Right,
mistakes
right.
and loving those mistakes.
And mistakes can sometimes turn into the most fascinating things that you never thought you'd discover.
Absolutely, absolutely. So maybe this is a good follow-up question. Like all artists, Luisa, you have your joys and probably your frustrations. So what advice can you give young or emerging poets and writers about the writing life, and any advice to those who hope to be published someday?
Well, I've said things about vulnerability, how it's okay to feel things and to feel deeply and to not abandon that capacity for feeling. I also think that it's important to read, to keep feeding that spark, to find the things that move you and that are resonant inside of you. Because I also have done a poetry practice for a good long while now. I think that there is value in setting aside time to do this, And your practice, your poetry practice or your writing practice may look different from mine, may look different from Tracy's or Courtney's or Matt's or yours, Michael, but it is important to cultivate a space where this thing can happen, that dreaming time that I was talking about earlier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I just want to remind people again, if you're watching, put your questions in the Facebook comments. I have a couple more here that I thought of. I remember when you were sworn in, it was a really moving time for me to watch you be sworn in on the live stream from the governor's office. And I think they asked you to, in your swearing in, they asked you to defend and support the Constitution of Virginia. So, what does that mean to you as a poet?
Well, I can't like speak about the fine details, but the general idea is, I think, similar to what we were talking about earlier when we were talking about the poetry of engagement, how language is a way of witnessing to the world. And so for me, it means that poetry is this area in which you can express your citizenship, you can defend your citizenship with your imagination, with words, with your desire to tell the truth in language, in the way that poetry knows how. So sometimes we make up things as writers, but the making up of things has a purpose. It's not to delude people. It's not to intentionally lead astray. It's not to intentionally cover up a thing or to say that something is when it isn't. It's another way of arriving at the truth. So what we do as poets and writers and artists is to show what is possible. And I think that's important in, setting our sights on the real prizes ahead. What do we really want? Not just as individuals, but as a community, as people who are part of a bigger thing than our individual selves, which is why it's so important to wear your masks, go vote, right?
And I think that kind of leads into another one of the themes you mentioned in some of your remarks throughout the time since you've been sworn in, is poetry as a way of living in the world. And so, helping people to find what poetry can tell us about living in that world, in the world we live in, which is wonderful. I mean,
right. And you don't have to write a poem a day. You can read something. You can read poems. Make it part of your just your habit. Build up a habit that makes space for poetry, make space for the imagination, make space for possibility. As Courtney said, make space for joy and the other things that are attendant to it.
And you just mentioned writing a poem every day.
Mhm.
So some of you who are watching may not know that Luisa, you've been writing a poem every day for how many years now has that been?
This November, it's going to be 10 years.
10 years. So what has that practice taught you about both yourself and your work?
Yeah, I was talking about this too with another friend who interviewed me on a podcast recently, former student, and I said, I'm a Virgo. So there's a side of me that's very perfectionist, wants everything like, ship shape, squared away. But this process of writing daily has made me realize that there are things that I can just watch unfold without my having to control every part of the process. And that teaches me some feedback about the way I use language, the way I like to embody poems. And so it's a more, I guess, flexible space in which I can try to be myself. So in many ways, it's taught me about letting go, as Tracy was talking about earlier, let go, so you can get to things that might not have a chance to bubble up to the surface. So this space of practicing every day is not just practice in the sense of rehearsal. It's practice in the sense that you cultivate the doing of something over a regular period of time, and you make that commitment because you find meaning in that process. And so that's what it is for me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't feel that it's a burden. I don't feel that it's a duty. I come to it, there's no set time of the day. I come to it when I feel like it's going to happen and I need it to happen and I can make it happen. I don't say, okay, at 9 o'clock in the evening, I drop everything and just force myself to write no matter what. It doesn't happen that way.
So have you ever had a more set time of the day where that was your writing time? No.
No, but as I said to some people who were asking about it, during a school year when I'm teaching and have a lot of other things on my plate, it tends to happen later in the day,
Right.
like after dinner or after I've done whatever I need to do for the work stuff. And then I feel like this is the time I can claim for myself. So it's kind of like my reward to myself. I can get to my poetry now.
Very cool. I want to just give a last call out there on those who are watching on the live stream. Put your questions in the comments and we'll try to get to them. Oh, here comes a question right here. Uh, speak of a question. So here's a question from Sean Gervin. As a poet, do you relate to visual artists in a way? Your daughter is a wonderful artist. And do you
Mm-hmm.
draw or paint?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is the question, do I draw or paint?
Right.
Yeah, I do. I think we've all in the family, we've all been sort of like, we like doing that stuff. We like arts and crafts. We like drawing and painting. All my daughters do some kind of art like that. So I also like writing poems about art. I have written quite a number of ekphrastic poems, but I think the tactile things that you can touch with your hands,
Right.
things you can feel, the surfaces and textures of. It's so important because poetry is also about awakening the senses. And so I think that just gives me the feeling of a different kind of area in which I am exercising the same faculties of my imagination, just in a different medium. So I like to hand bind books also. One of the things I've done recently was I have a poet friend in California, Eileen Tabios, and she's building a miniature book library and she has been sending out these little books, like 3 by 3 inches, to friends who want to play with them, do something, make something out of them. And so I received
Very
one in the mail like 2 weeks ago, and I illustrated and wrote out a poem um, on one of these based on a ghazal that I had written. And you can find it on her, pictures are on her blog. I think if you just Google Eileen Tabios and miniature book library, you'll find your way to it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
We have a comment, which is a very nice comment. It's from Natasha Robinson, and she
Mhm.
says, and it kind of leads into one of my last questions. And she says, "I rarely leave the house. Your readings today and this discussion have been a beautiful way to transport my mind away from this small space and into a broader world. Thank you, thank you, thank you." And she wrote some
Thank you. Thank you
beautiful
so much
poetry.
for your words. Really
Um,
appreciate it.
so how do you see this? This is a new day where we are not getting together in person and we can't
Yeah.
have live poetry readings. On one hand, that's a problem, but on the other
Mhm.
hand, it's perhaps an opportunity or a
Yeah.
small silver lining. So
Yeah.
as poet laureate, how do you see yourself navigating through that, finding
Yeah.
the
Well,
possible pitfalls and making them into silver linings?
right. So I also miss hugging people, seeing people in person, going out with them, sitting at events and programs, in person, enjoying that together. Even just going out and moving about in the world, it just feels very different now, and I'm hoping that it isn't going to be like this forever, that somebody finds a vaccine and we all kind of benefit from that and we come out and shed these old pandemic skins and we'll be like butterflies reborn into the new world, right? But on the other hand, the technology that we are seeing people put to use right now is helpful in creating these ways in which we can interact. So, like, I'm pretty thrilled that I'm reading, or we have read, not just to a local Hampton Roads audience. I know There are friends in Singapore, maybe Manila who are watching, maybe Baguio, hi everybody. I wish I could shake your hands or hug you in person, but this is what we can do right now. I also said in some of their interviews that I think that this is such a generous space. I'm seeing a lot of generosity. Lots of writers and artists are participating in many of these things, and I just see them just being so willing to participate in these things and give of their time, give of their knowledge of their art, and share these widely. So there's that. And I think that those are the good parts. And I hope we find more ways to enhance the positive aspects of this interaction.
And this silver lining of the technology and the reach that maybe we wouldn't have had, because now you can reach people anywhere in the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And the underrepresented poets you were talking about may be more reachable in some
Yeah.
ways this way.
Yeah. So I'm in the process of revamping my website or putting it up to date. And so I intend to use it as a way to reach out to others and vice versa, them to reach out to me. So stay tuned. It might not happen right away because things are kind of like chaotic right now, school opening and such, but
Sure.
I have things I want to do with you in
And-
poetry, for poetry, through poetry.
And your website address is?
LuisaIgloria.com.
Perfect.